Alright, let's see if this works. Statement begins. There's not much I can do to prove to you that this is my first time listening, so I will not be putting much energy towards convincing you. First time listener, long time theorist. My name is Edwin Endicott, I use they them pronouns, and I am an avid audio fiction listener. My primary source of evidence? I'm the only person I know who is entirely caught up on Welcome to Night Vale. Yes, you heard me correctly. Other favourites include 36 Questions and Spirit Box Radio. My history of being a theorist runs deep. In my bones, most recent evidence includes that of Gravity Falls' The Book of Bill, in which I spearheaded a 235-slide PowerPoint in the summer of 2024, depicting all of the hidden secrets of thisisnotawebsite.com. Don't believe me? Ask Emmeline Butternubbins. The Magnus Archives premiered on March 24th, 2016 and completed its main story in 2021. In the broadest of terms, it depicts Jonathan Sims, head archivist of the Magnus Institute, recording and debriefing paranormal statements. I was warned that the episodic nature of this show would result in an extremely slow, serialized story. I disagree entirely. As I progressed through the first episodes, I felt a familiar suspicion under my skin. All these small details, they held an air of importance. I think this intrigue inherently stems from the title itself. What is the Institute archiving? And why? So, as a proper theorist, I began a spreadsheet, which spread into 2 spreadsheets, which of course spread into some observations and theories. Today I'll be discussing episodes 1 to 18, from the anglerfish to the man upstairs. Consider this your spoiler warning. My dear friend Ash has watched the whole series and described this venture as the perfect way to encounter this story, for as she described it, every single detail means nothing until it all means everything. This is my archive of the Magnus Archives. Welcome to First Time Listener. As for my personal opinions, I love it. I'm known to struggle with extremely episodic stories due to their lack of consistency and consequences. However, every episode of the Magnus Archives is intriguing, tense, and unpredictable. Jonathan Sims, the actor, has this amazing quality to be the only person in the room, yet make every statement incredibly distinct through his tone and inflection. It's subtlety at its finest. My favourite episodes so far include Episode 9, A Father's Love, Episode 11, The Dreamer, and Episode 15, Lost John's Cave. My least favourite episode is Episode 16, Arachnophobia. Not for lack of quality, of course, but for the sake of a spider following a man to have not felt scary in comparison to other stories. In fact, it reminded me of a certain deadly snail that's grown popular amongst modern thought puzzles. As a character, Jonathan Sims can be described as a delightful buzzkill. His snarky remarks and discredits are always amusing. I particularly like the phrase in episode 6.
I think the most important lines in this statement come at the very end. Antipsychotic medication and disbelief are, I think, exactly what Mr. Vittery needed to get through his problem with, ghost spiders.
Jonathan Sims has disdainfully referenced a researcher named Martin multiple times. I look forward to meeting him. I'm unsure if Martin is truly a lousy researcher, or if Jonathan is simply very particular. Both appear equally plausible. I'm also interested in learning more about this Rosie. She was first mentioned in episode 11, Dreamer, as Jonathan referenced going to her for advice. He did not clarify her age, role, or seniority at the Magnus Institute. Very curious. Furthermore, the head of the Institute, Elias Bouchard, sounds decent enough. He's been referenced multiple times, and I've only heard him speak once to chastise Jonathan. understandably, over a complaint filed by episode 13's subject, Naomi Hearns, on Jonathan's sour attitude towards her. But that's enough of my personal opinions. Let's talk about the spreadsheets. Both spreadsheets have the same information but are categorized in two ways, one by episode and one by event chronology. The categories of each spreadsheet includes event date, statement maker, episode number, locations, notable names, themes and connections, summary and notes, and recorded by. At this point, recorded by is mostly Jonathan Sims. I will start with the small things, then grow to the bigger revelations. I will not be summarizing every episode, as the most likely viewers of this series have already seen it, or more optimistically, are watching it with me. Common threads and motifs across multiple episodes include burning and fires, meat, organs, and blood, apples within 3 separate episodes, which I admit is likely far-fetched, and the smell of ozone, or as sometimes described as rain on pavement. However, I will say that there were also multiple mentions in multiple stories of, quote, coppery smells that were later associated with old blood. So this could simply be another phrase for such a thing. As of episode 13 alone, it was revealed that subject Naomi Hearn, of complaint filing fame, was the fiancée of the recently deceased Evan Lucas. This came into play in episode 17, Bone Turner's Tale, when Elias interrupted Jonathan's recording, stating,
Regardless, I would prefer that you not antagonize anyone connected to the Lucas family. They are patrons of the Institute after all.
I can only assume that these patrons will return in later stories, predictably as an obstacle towards Jonathan's archiving. I would also like to mention Graham. Episode 3, Across the Street, depicts Amy Patel's observations of her neighbour, in which a spindly creature took over Graham Folger, changing his appearance entirely in September 2005. I am to believe this might be the same creature in episode 9, A Father's Love. I could have sworn I heard the name Graham in previous episodes, however, he was not mentioned in episodes 1 or 2. Perhaps it was my own precognitive tendencies that came into play there. Graham was mentioned in the later episode 11, Dreamer. Antonio Blake, which is a fake name, referenced having just gone through a breakup with a Graham 6 years prior to the events of his story. As this took place in 2014, I am left to wonder if his Graham had blonde curly hair, as they started dating 4 years after episode 3, and the new possessed Graham has blonde curly hair. And with my reference to episode 11, The Dreamer, it seems like an obvious segue to discuss Gertrude Robinson, Jonathan Sims' predecessor, as head archivist. I regretfully don't have any more leads aside from what's clearly said in the episode. I feel equally ill-informed regarding episode 6, Squirrel, and The Woman in Red, of which Jonathan Sims implied to be a Jane Prentice. We'll report back soon on the matter. On the subject of employees, Martin has been out sick with stomach problems for 2 episodes, last seen in episode 16, Arachnophobia. If I'm to believe that every detail is important, I can only conclude that Martin is not just sick, but perhaps is on leave for other purposes. Based solely on the word stomach, I'm reminded of episode 10, Vampire Killer, and Trevor Herbert's grotesque descriptions of the creatures. It's notable to mention that vampires communicate telepathically, which, for an audio format, is not something that we as an audience would notice. Perhaps Martin is a vampire, and perhaps Jonathan is simply prejudiced. Next up, I couldn't help but notice a similar description between 2 characters' likenesses, despite the different names and drastically different time periods. I'm referring to John in episode 2, Do Not Open, and Raymond Fielding in episode 8, Burned Out. In episode 2, this John was described as...
He was short, very short, and felt like he had an odd density to him. His hair was brownish, I think, cut quite short, and he was clean-shaven. His face and dress were utterly unremarkable.
It was also mentioned that he was wearing a jacket. Similarly, Raymond Fielding was described as
He was quite young, white, maybe mid-20s, clean-shaven with shaggy chestnut brown hair. His coat was quite an old cut. It seemed to me he looked like something out of an old Polaroid.
Oh, God. This struck me as odd, considering John's encounter happened in the 1980s and Raymond's in November 2006. Honestly, in episode 2, when I first heard the name John, I questioned whether or not it was Jonathan Sims himself. On that note, episode 2, Do Not Open, has a very odd placement in the timeline. Every story takes place 1990 and onwards except for 2. The earliest one, episode 7, The Piper, occurred during World War I. I think the primary function of the story was to reference the name Joseph Rayner, of which we will discuss later. The second earliest was Do Not Open. Jonathan Gillespie was given a coffin to care for by a mysterious John, sold for £10,000. I suspect this took place in the early 80s. The statement happened in 1998, and Jonathan Gillespie himself said it took him nearly 20 years to talk about it. This evidence would make Do Not Open the very first event in our modern timeline. This leads me to my biggest revelation. It's time to talk about the library, the Rayner family, and the People's Church of the Divine Host. There are 2 statements regarding books from the library of Jürgen Leitner. Leitner is described in episode 4, Page Turner, as a Scandinavian recluse who collected old books in the 1990s focused on demonology and the arcane. He frequented Pinhole Books, owned by Mary Key. Mary's son, Gerard Key, bought the book Ex Altiora from subject Dominic Swain in winter of 2012. Ex Altiora was written by Jürgen Leitner and MacGregor Mathers and roughly translates to From Higher or Out of the Heights. Key proceeded to burn it and stated to Swain after the exchange,
My mother doesn't always know what's best for our family.
Gerard Key was also a prominent figure in episode 12, First Aid, having a red book and a brass pendant of an eye. The other statement was in episode 17, Bone Turner's Tale. Sebastian Adekoya worked at the Chiswick Library and lent the Bone Turner to his childhood friend, the Petty Terror, Jared Hopworth, in 1996. The book itself was a gruesome addition to the Canterbury Tales. Sebastian only remembered the line,
And from his rib a flute to play that merry tune of Marrow took.
Jared broke into the library and, after a physical altercation, stole the book from Adekoya. Adekoya described Jared's ribs as sharp, as if they tried to bite him. He let Jared have the book. Jonathan Sims attempted to follow up, but it was discovered that Adekoya was dead, found mangled in the middle of a street in 2006. The reference to Jürgen Leitner's library prompted a worried response from Jonathan. He said in episode 4,
If I never hear the name Jürgen Leitner again, it will be too soon. I suppose it was too much to hope that we'd finally dealt with all the remainder of his library after the incident in 1994.
It's not 1994. A very interesting year. Let's look at that time frame in episode 9, A Father's Love. Robert Montauk was a serial killer, active from 1990 to 1995, murdering 40 and keeping their hearts in glass jars in his backyard shed. His daughter, subject Julia Montauk, recounts his supposed first kill in the beginning of this episode. It was her mother. However, Julia made it abundantly clear that she did not think Robert killed Mother Montauk, and that it was much more mysterious and cold. She believes he began to kill after this. Mother Montauk had a pendant left on the table of the night of her disappearance, a silver hand with a closed eye. It was apparently a symbol of a London-based cult. Robert Montauk's final kill of Christopher Long was witnessed by Julia Montauk. Julia ran into the shed after being chased by a mysterious creature. Her father held a knife at Christopher's heart, chanting as every heart in the shed beat to the same rhythm as the one in his hand. He stabbed the heart, and the beating stopped. He was arrested in 1995, but it is not clear how long he evaded arrest, putting this final kill somewhere between 1994 and 1995. Christopher Lawn had an identical silver pendant to that of Mother Montauk. It was said that he was in the same cult. However, a few years before his arrest, Julia Montauk answered the phone instead of her father in 1993. It was a Detective Rayner. Rayner and Robert Montauk engaged in a quiet, angry conversation, saying the words, "No, not already, do it yourself." Robert later agreed that he would do it quickly. It isn't clear what he was told to do, but he spent the rest of the day inside the shed. This leads me once again to the Rayner family. They were mentioned 3 times. The oldest reference to the Rayners is, as mentioned before, in episode 7, The Piper. He was a private that Subject Sergeant Clarence Barry and Lieutenant Wilfred Owen witnessed die in a medical tent in France. Jonathan Sims himself states,
And I feel like I recognize the name Joseph Rayner from somewhere, though for the life of me I couldn't say where.
The second time was that of Detective Rayner. And the final mention of a Rayner is at the end of A Father's Love. Mother Montauk and Christopher Lawn were members of the People's Church of the Divine Host. The cult was created by a defunct Pentecostal minister in the late 1980s and early 1990s. That minister's name was Maxwell Rayner. Maxwell Rayner disappeared from the public eye in 1994. From these observations, it is clear to me that Jürgen Leitner's library and Maxwell Rayner's cult are very likely connected, as both were dissolved in 1994. It is uncertain as to whether they were rivals or conspirators. Is Detective Rayner actually Maxwell Rayner, or is somehow related to him? Was the cult preventing attacks from a mysterious spindly creature or causing them? The most I could directly connect include Gerard Key's brass eye pendant, serving as an opposition to Mother Montauk and Christopher Lawn's silver hand with closed eye. Seeing as Gerard burned one of Leitner's books, perhaps the brass eye wearers are antagonistic to the People's Church of the Divine Host? What is the Divine Host? Is it Maxwell? Are they creating a host or finding one? And a host of what? Was it Gertrude? Will it be Jonathan? I also distinctly remember Julia using the phrase to describe the scent of the shed as tinned meat. Meat is a key factor in episode 18, The Man Upstairs. Christopher Denko's upstairs neighbour, Toby Carlyle, has attached all sorts of rotting meat across his walls and floors. However, Carlyle had absolutely no bank statements or rapport with local butchers. Jonathan Sims himself asks,
Where was he getting the meat?
This event was in 2007, long after Montauk's arrest in 1995, although tinned meat lasts a very long time. I believe I wrung out my stronger theories. There are likely observations I haven't mentioned due to flimsiness and time constraints. Regardless, copies of my spreadsheet will be linked in the description below for all those interested in my research or are excited to see me update it. And no, I will not be reading the comments because frankly I do not trust you to keep your spoilers away from me. Perhaps I'll put in my own research team to sort some out and send me a few. I'm not exactly sure what my next chunk of episodes will be, seeing as I don't actually know when season 1 ends. I suppose I'll just follow it until more theories pop up than observations. Regardless, thank you for listening. Let me know if you would like to hear more, although it will likely never get all the way to me. Until next time. Statement ends.